Hey, my name is Lester Spence. I'm an associate professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. I'm sorry I cannot be here in person to fulfill my duties as chair and discussant. Unfortunately, my travel arrangements made it impossible to be able to get home to Baltimore at the same time as I serve as a chair and discussant of this panel. So what I want to do, given that it's 21st century, is actually try to do it virtually. So we all have we have these, and I'll have timer functions. So the first thing I would suggest, given that we have four papers and approximately an hour and 45 minutes to go to work with, is that each of you time yourselves and give yourself about 15 minutes or so. And in general, I think that it's a good habit to develop, timing yourself as opposed to letting someone else do it. And then after the papers, and what we'll do is, given that Hannah Walker's paper is technically not in the program, we'll go in the order of the panel. We'll go Eckhouse, descriptive representation of political power, Lanianu, police, politics, demobilization, Gonzalez, resilience or repression, and then we'll go with Walker, targeted the mobilizing effects of perceptions on unfair policing practices. And then what we'll do is, after each of those papers, I will give comments. So do me a favor, pause this video, and then we'll have the papers, and then afterwards I'll talk about the papers as a suite, and then I'll talk about the individual papers. Okay, as a suite of papers, I find that these papers actually both speak to each other in really, really interesting ways. So Walker, for example, is actually looking at mechanisms that kind of deal with the processes that kind of Lanianu on the one hand and Eckhouse on the other, trying to kind of detail in different ways. And then what Gonzalez's work brings out is kind of the challenges of political participation and kind of dealing with policy. Well, at least that's kind of indirect, but I think that's there. And then more broadly, I think that they each speak to, even though you're talking about different contexts, I think they each speak to the role of the neoliberal turn on policing, both in how policing works, and I think in its effects, and also in pushback. And in this way, I think this panel, I attended a number of panels on policing on Friday, and I found that while the papers on those panels were actually okay, I found that this panel, what I appreciated about the papers on this particular panel, is that they're all fairly critical, and they all, to a certain extent, think about police not just as an entity that's supposed to solve crime, but more of it as an agent of social control. And that move enables you to engage in, or enables us to have a conversation more about the politics of policing and the political economy behind policing, as opposed to just thinking institutionally about what do we have to do to get police to solve crime better, right? So on that note, what I'll do is I'm going to take the papers in turn. I'm going to first look at the Eckhouse paper on descriptive representation. I have a couple of quick comments. This paper makes a simple demographic argument that more blacks on the city council will reduce arrests. I work on this paper in a couple of different ways. First, cities actually differ as to the power of city councils. Some cities have strong mayors and weak city councils. Some cities have strong city councils and weak mayors. Some cities have city managers. So what do these institutional dynamics do if we actually come up with a variable that actually assesses these different city types? How would this mediate the effect of having blacks on city council? I don't know, but it's worth actually interrogating. Similarly, while arrests point to the role police play as agents of social control, It's clear from the experience of Ferguson that that police served also as agents of revenue generation. There's already research that suggests that black representation on the city council affects this dynamic. Sands, and you're citing a paper by Sands elsewhere in this, like a 2016 paper by Sands. There's a 2017 paper that deals with dynamic. I cited. I'll also test, and I think that Jessica Traunstein has done work on this. If we also just look at absolute just spending on police just in general, how do black city councils actually affect spending on police? Finally, I suggest that the work on representation is a bit more varied than suggested as it stands. To an extent, your argument's kind of top down when it could be bottom up. It could be that people have more political power in cities with more black city council members, and as a result are exerting more power as far as their preferences on policing is concerned. Of course, the challenge here is that some black folk actually want policing, right? Moving to the Lanianu paper. Now, this paper is actually already out in the world. So to the extent what I want to do is talk more so about kind of what you can do going forward to the extent you're interested in this going forward. The comparative project outlined here is excellent first step in examining the relationship between the carceral state, or perhaps different forms of carceral states in advanced democracies, and political participation. Although the work is already out there, I suggest in the future IO want to do a couple of different things. More broadly, here I'm being a bit self-serving. I think you want to connect the policing dynamics to broader changes in the political economy. What's happening in the United States and Great Britain is not simply the Jim Crow or the British equivalent of it, but the neoliberal turn. This has effects on policing, on the welfare state, on labor unions, and through those dynamics on the possibilities of solidarity on the one hand and political participation on the other. But in as much as these dynamics have alongside interracial effects, those effects might be complicated. I spent at least some time thinking through and writing about how these dynamics may be differentially shaping the countries under examination. One of the signal challenges scholars of racial politics have to wrestle with is the tendency to think about racial politics almost solely in parochial terms. This work alongside Gonzalez helps us get out of that parochial American box, but it has to be a bit richer. More narrowly, you already published a work suggesting somewhat counterintuitive findings. I'm surprised you didn't cite your own work and use that work to make a series of assumptions about the extent to which the effects you find carry over in other contexts. Secondarily, you'd really want to look at individual measures as the most important article that you in this body of work, Vessel Weaver and Amy Lerman's paper. It looks at the effect of criminal justice contact on individual propensity to vote rather than aggregate propensity. And along similar lines, and I'm coming back to Walker's paper in a second. Walker's paper looks at individual level stuff too. Third, along those lines, the communities that Amy Lerman and Vessel Weaver look at are not only black, they're poor. Although I think you run interaction effects, you really want to not only get a sense of how individuals in policed areas interact with police, you'd also want to get a sense of how the state itself interacts with individuals in these spaces. We know that the UK has a more robust suite of social welfare policies than the states do, but we also know that this is changing as a result of the neoliberal turn. How do these dynamics affect political participation? And then finally, and then this speaks to the Walker paper that I'll come back to in a second, what you really want to do is see if you can get measures that look at political participation outside of voting, including non-traditional means. Great paper, and by the way, either this paper or maybe another paper you've written got the Best Paper Award. Congratulations. Really, really proud of you. Well, proud. It's not like I had anything to do with it, but I think it's really, really dope. The Gonzalez paper. This work is critically important as in the U.S. and elsewhere, we've discussions about how to effectively reform police, and in some instances given the rise of abolition, whether police reform is even possible. Gonzalez uses two cases from Latin America, one in Colombia and one in Brazil, in which police did reform, but not in ways that significantly reduced police autonomy and corruption. And she does so in order to posit a dynamic model of policy change that in effect deals with those reforms that don't actually reform. Although we know that crisis can spark enduring change, Gonzalez suggests that in these and in other instances regarding the police, even when change occurs, the change is slight. Of the 3 papers offered, Gonzalez's work has probably the most potential of helping us think through policy change on the ground in the U.S. given the rise of Black Lives Matter. However, I suggest a few different areas of work. While the neoliberal turn arguably begins in Chile in the early 70s, by the 90s we see it spread throughout Latin America. When Gonzalez writes of the new public management, we see its tendrils in Latin American bureaucracies. Professionalization combined with actuarial metrics, combined with viewing citizens as consumers and public servants as service providers. The new public management philosophy is in general antithetical to democracy, as democracy viewed under public management is often inefficient. It seems to me that the idea of new public management itself can work as a constraint on the nature of police change. And Gonzalez's model doesn't allow for the role of ideology as something that structures how we understand the nature of crisis and then how we understand the solution to it. How does the governing paradigm itself shape and constrain policies? But also, where's the independent role for ideas? Right? Neither the exogenous nor the endogenous forces you mentioned include a role for ideas themselves. Gonzalez argues that police themselves end up pushing back against policy even when crises exist, but the evidence for police as independent actors is limited. It needs to be a lot more robust. We know that the police get what they want. We know that they have their interests met, but how do we know that this comes from their actions as opposed to either some other party like politicians or to the general institutional framework that kind of bakes police autonomy in? Even in the presence of crisis, if autonomy is already kind of baked in, institutionally speaking, we wouldn't necessarily expect autonomy to be removed. And even if it's kind of removed temporarily, we wouldn't expect that to stick. And again, this could not stick either because of the police or because of other actors. Or just because, again, the system just makes it less likely. The system kind of creates a kind of a bounce back or a dynamic. On another related note, we have a sense of how people understand corruption in the police, but what role does the media and other kind of information sources play in communicating and developing ideas about the crisis and about the solution? Again, ideas, but also institutions like the media. You actually don't talk about why you chose the cases you did. Why these 2 cases, what are the similarities, what are the differences? You got what appears to be a national police force on one hand and a state police force on the other, although I might be misreading that. Are these differences important? Finally, I'm struck by the corruption case involving sex. There's something about sex and policing that makes corruption involving these issues particularly pernicious, I think, in comparison to murder and other forms of police brutality. The thing that jumps out at me, and particularly when you're talking about internal dynamic and stuff internal to the force, the thing that jumps out at me when I was reading about that particular form of corruption was a case in Detroit where we had approximately 10 to 15,000 rape kits that were just put in, basically discarded and found in a warehouse that hadn't been tested. And it's been really easy to mobilize people in cases of extreme acts, spectacular acts of violence and murder. But these types of things are kind of different. Are different. It seems to me is harder to work with. I don't think that that doesn't necessarily go in this paper, but it's worth kind of exploring. Some people have already done it, but it's worth kind of exploring. And then finally, the Hannah Walker paper. There's actually only, this paper is pretty much, if it's not out already, I'd be really surprised. I think it's pretty much ready to go. I think what I would do is you mine some of the literature in some of the older literature, but I go back even further because you're absolutely right. Like the pieces of literature that look at basically the relationship between racial consciousness or group consciousness and political participation. a lot of that literature points clearly to the relationship that you're teasing out. That is, it's not just that I'm black, but it's just that but being black interacts with a sense of racism and injustice, and that dynamic spurs me to political action. So I look to that literature and do a little bit more work, even for the purpose of kind of educating people about that. Secondarily, though, I'm wondering if it's possible to get at some contextual measures, right? So here I am. So the week of the Freddie Gray uprising, I happened to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at a cousin's wedding. Tulsa, Oklahoma had experienced there was a police killing in Tulsa, Oklahoma that coincided with the killing of Freddie Gray, but you had significant political protest in Baltimore, and you had no protest from what I could see in Tulsa. Now, granted, we're not talking about police killings; we're talking about individual encounters with the police. But it seems to me that there's some context in which the narrative that police encounters are unjust is more prevalent than others, right? So, and if you think about this, maybe there are more opportunity structures for the relationship you're positing to transform into or to lead to to protest acts in some spaces than others. And your work doesn't necessarily get at that. You might not be able to, but it's worth actually at least thinking about that, if not in this piece, but going forward. Again, so I'm right at about 16 minutes. I'm about time. I really thank you all for the work. It's really, really important, not just intellectually for us thinking about how entities like the police operate, how political participation rises and falls, how policies change over time, but it's really important politically. Particularly given that even as we've got this political opening to talk about police, we've really only got a few people doing really critical work, as opposed to this much broader suite of work that really takes kind of police as a given, that really just wants to tinker around the edges. So I hope as it stands right now, I've seen one of you. I hope I get a chance to see the rest of you sometime while we're here. And if not, I look forward to reading your work in the future. Peace.